Hello and welcome to our lecture on virtualization. So start off, let's talk about what is virtualization. Virtualization is defined as the act of creating a virtual rather than actual version of something, including a virtual computer hardware platform, storage devices, as well as computer network resources. So we can see down here an illustration that I think shows this pretty well. We have some hardware, and on that hardware, we create a level of abstraction known as a virtualization layer. And on top of this virtualization layer, we can create multiple sort of individual computers. So you can see that each one of these are isolated in this little box, and they have an operating system, and they can run apps on top of that operating system. And they're seen as just independent computers on the network. So they can't actually mess with each other's data even though they're running on the same hardware platform. So what are some of the pros of virtualization? Well, obviously we can run multiple operating systems simultaneously. For instance, I can have a Windows machine, but like we'll be doing here in this class, we'll set up several Linux virtual machines that we can run on there. Of course, that can go in the other direction as well. You could have a Linux-based desktop where you're running Windows virtual machines or other operating systems as well. It gives us the ability to do easier software installations. So there's pre-packaged virtual machines that we can configure called appliances, and those are very easy to import and just go ahead and boot up. So we don't even have to go through the process of installing the operating system. Additionally, there's snapshots. Let's say we're about to install some software and we're not sure if it's going to conflict with some other software on our machine. Then what we can do is take a snapshot beforehand, install the software, and if there's any problems, we can actually roll back to when that snapshot was first taken. Okay, so that's a very nice feature in that regard. And then, of course, rapid deployment for an IT infrastructure. If we're trying to provision several virtual machines, sometimes it helps to go ahead and have a template out there that we can just clone and then build off of that. Testing and disaster recovery. We don't always have enough machines to have a full testing environment. So one nice thing about virtualization is that we can go ahead and virtualize our testing environment and try to test out some disaster recovery strategies that way. Infrastructure consolidation. So as you saw in that last illustration, we're running multiple operating systems on one piece of hardware. This is in contrast to back in the day when each operating system had to be its own computer on its own hardware. So as you can see here, this one piece of hardware is basically serving the purpose of 4 different computers. So from that, we can save electricity and we can also maximize hardware usage. As you're virtualizing, you'll notice that if you look at the performance stats, most of the time the CPU is idle. So if the CPU is idle, then we're really not getting all of our money's worth out of that CPU, especially if we're having to buy 4 different computers just to spin up these 4 different machines. So it's much better to go ahead and consolidate them where possible so that we can take advantage and maximize the usage of all of the hardware. Alright, so some terminology that we'll hear as we're talking about virtualization. The host operating system. So the host operating system is the operating system that the virtual machines will be running on. Okay, so this is the physical computer. The guest operating system is the virtual machine's operating system. So when we create a virtual machine and we install that OS, then we call that virtual machine our guest. Speaking of virtual machines, what are they? Conceptually, we can think of them as a container that runs a virtualized environment. It contains hardware settings and allocations as well as state information. So you'll see as we go through setting up a virtual machine, based on the hardware that's in our computer, we can allocate a certain amount of processor, so a certain number of processors or cores to the virtual machine. We could also allocate a certain amount of memory or RAM to that virtual machine. Guest additions. So guest additions are something that each hypervisor or virtual machine platform usually provides, and what it does is it's special software that allows you to improve the performance of your virtual machine, as well as to add some extra features that make it a little bit easier to use the virtual machine. So we'll see how the guest editions work with VirtualBox, which is the hypervisor we'll be using. But basically, it gives us some extra features like being able to full screen the virtual machine, being able to drag and drop from our host operating system to our guest operating system, being able to copy and paste on the clipboard, and so on. Okay, so hypervisor, that's the software or hardware that creates and runs the VMs. So the one we're going to be using is VirtualBox. There's several other prominent hypervisors out there. VMware is a big player in the game, Zen Server as well. And Windows also has a hypervisor. It's called Hyper-V. Okay, but what we're going to be focusing on is Oracle VirtualBox, and primarily because it's free. So VirtualBox was formerly owned by Sun Microsystems, so it was previously called Sun VirtualBox, and then Sun XVM VirtualBox, and then Inotech VirtualBox. Um, but now it's owned by Oracle. So Oracle bought Sun. That's when Oracle took over Java, and then they also took over the other projects that Sun had, like VirtualBox. It is a free and open source hypervisor for x86 based, so Intel based computers, or the x86 instruction set, so AMD based processors are x86 as well. It supports a variety of hosts, so many operating systems, including the top three that uh, uh, one of us would probably be running, like Windows, Linux, OS 10. It also supports Solaris and Open Solaris. Ports are available for other operating systems such as FreeBSD and Gnode. So Inotech was the initial company that owned VirtualBox or created VirtualBox. They were acquired by Sun Microsystems back in 2008. Oracle then acquired Sun in 2010, and that's where we get to where we are today. So what are some notable features? One nice thing is we're almost at feature parity with all of the major hypervisors out there. There are some features that are offered by some that aren't by others, but for the most part, we can expect these things to be present. So the ability to run 64-bit guest. Of course, we're going to need a 64-bit processor to be able to do that. However, I don't think that that they are really selling 32-bit processors anymore. So more than likely, if you have a fairly recent laptop, as in within the past 6 or so years, you're not going to have to worry about not being able to run 64-bit guest. Snapshots, so that ability to sort of take a picture of what the computer looks like at this moment and then roll back to that at a later time if we want to. Seamless mode, so I'll leave it as an exercise to you to look up some of these things. Shared clipboard, we talked about that. Shared folders is another big one. The ability to share like your downloads folder on your host operating system with your guest operating system. There's command line interaction, which leads to some neat things like being able to script out the creation of virtual machines. We have public APIs available in numerous programming languages or protocols like SOAP and XPCOM that we can communicate with VirtualBox over. There is limited support for 3D graphics acceleration. I believe that's only supported on a Windows-based host. The ability to access the hard disk, performing raw access to the hard disk, so there's no abstraction layers that we're trying to go through in order to get that access that might slow us down. 2D video output acceleration and EFI support. Alright, so just real quick, let's walk through the process of how we would create a virtual machine. The first thing we would do is open up the VirtualBox VM Manager. So it looks something like this, and I realize if you're on Windows, if you're on Linux, the UI may look a little bit different in that some icons may look different, or some things may be placed in different places. However, the principles are all the same. And I think that this window is mainly the same as well. So we have our virtual machines over on this side, and we have information about the virtual machines over on this side. So you can even go through and you see I have a bunch of VMs in here. You can organize them into categories like I did here, Windows and Linux, but that's not required. So if we want to create a virtual machine, we can simply click New right up here, and that's going to bring up this window where we can type in the name of our virtual machine. So let's say we're going to install Ubuntu, which is a major Linux distribution. So when we do that, it automatically picks or it guesses at the version. So we can see Ubuntu 64-bit here, and it's a Linux-based VM. If these are not correct, we would just want to drop it down and pick either the correct thing or what would be closest to the correct thing, and then click Continue. Okay, next thing it wants for us to do is to allocate some RAM. So how much RAM do we want to give this? For major distributions like Ubuntu, it has preset recommendations. We can see that the recommended memory size is 768 megabytes. I do recommend going above that if you can, if you got the RAM to spare. You can see that VirtualBox is able to detect how much RAM is in my computer. So I have 8 gigabytes of RAM. Now, you can assign RAM in this green zone and you can usually be okay. If you get into this orange or this red zone, then you're probably allocating too much and your host operating system is going to start to struggle to run. Okay, so my recommendation is a gigabyte, 2 gigabytes, just depending on the amount of RAM that you have. 1 gigabyte is more than enough to run Ubuntu smoothly so that you can have a good experience. Alright, so once you have that set, we'll just click Continue. We'll come in here and it asks us about the hard drive. So what are we going to need here? We need a hard drive to store this operating system on. And as you can imagine, we're going to create a virtual one. So we don't already have one, and we're not going to not use one. So let's just create a virtual hard disk now. Click Create. And it's going to come up and ask us what type. So there's several different types or file formats for creating a virtual hard drive. Since we're using VirtualBox, I tend to use VDI, so VirtualBox Disk Image. Of course, if you want for your hard drive to be cross-compatible with other hypervisors like VMware, you could do a VMDK. That's the native format used by VMware. You can see Parallels in here is another popular hypervisor, and then QEMU is an open source project for virtualization, and you can use one of theirs as well. I will note that if you choose VDI now and later on you come back and you say, man, I really want to switch over to VMware, but I don't want to recreate my VM, you can still do that. It's possible to export a hard drive from one format to another. Okay, so once you pick one of these, go ahead and click Continue. And let's see. Next thing it asks is, do we want to create this hard drive dynamically, or do we want for it to be a fixed size? So let me explain real quick what these two things mean. Let's say that we're going to allocate 20 gigabytes of hard drive space. Now, if we have a 60 gigabyte hard drive, which more than likely we have a lot more space than that nowadays, but just for this example, a 60 gigabyte hard drive, that's going to take up a third of our space. Now, of course, when we first install an operating system, it's not going to take up the full 20 gigabytes. It may only take up 10 or 12, which means we have 8 gigabytes free that are seen as used but not actually used. So here's the difference. If we do fixed size, what it's going to do is, what the hypervisor is going to do is, it's going to go out and it's going to request a file that's 20 gigabytes big. And it's going to go ahead and take up all of that space. If we do dynamic allocation, then what it's going to do is it's going to create a virtual hard drive that's 20 gigabytes big, but the size on the host operating system is only going to be the size that is currently being taken up. So at first, after the installation is only going to be that 10 or 12 gigabytes. As we start adding files, it'll grow, and it'll grow up to 20 gigabytes. All right, so I usually recommend doing dynamically allocated. It allows us to save some of our host operating systems hard drive space. However, you do want to make sure that you do not overcommit too much, right? Because it's perfectly feasible that I could come in here and create 4 20 gigabyte dynamically allocated hard drives, and at first they'll all fit on my 60 gigabytes. But if we do the math, 4 times 20 is 80 gigabytes, and I only have 60 available. So eventually we could grow out of that space. So just something to think about as you're doing that. Again, I'd recommend doing dynamically allocated. We're not going to take up the full space here in this class. So there are there are minimum recommendations for the size of a hard drive in Ubuntu. I believe it's around 12 gigabytes. We do want to go above that though, and especially if we did dynamically allocated, we really don't have much to worry about in that regard. So just to be safe, I usually go ahead and allocate 20 gigabytes. Alright, so once you do that, you'll see your new VM down here in the list of your VMs in VirtualBox Manager. And if you want to, we can go back in and we can fine-tune some of those settings by highlighting this VM, the one that we just created, and clicking on Settings. Once we do that, it'll bring up the settings for our VM. You can see that there's different tabs for different portions of the configuration. The first one is just that basic information that we did during the setup of putting in the name and stuff like that. Moving over to the next tab, System, here's where we can get into readjusting the RAM. If later on we find that 1 gigabyte is not enough and we need to bump that up to 2, we could do that. We can change things like boot order, so we'd normally have to go into the BIOS of a computer to do that, but we can do that right here in the settings for VirtualBox. Moving to the next tab here, we have the processor tab. So if you remember, I'd mentioned that we can allocate a certain amount of processors. So if you have it, and again, we have this nice color code where green is sort of the acceptable range, and then red is you're probably allocating too much. But if you have it, you may want to give it 2 processors. If you don't, Ubuntu will run just fine with 1 processor. You just may experience a little bit of sluggishness from time to time. Okay. Moving over to display, we can allocate a certain amount of video memory so that we can, be able to display the desktop environment. It does work okay with 12. Sometimes I jack this up to 128. There's no harm in that. Monitor count, if you have dual monitors, then you can bump this up to 2, and when you start up the VM, it'll take up both of those monitors, so that's kind of neat there. Storage, so over here is where we see the hard drive that we created. If you remember, I recommended the VDI image, so Ubuntu.vdi is the hard drive that it created. It connected it onto this SATA controller, which is a controller for hard drives and CD drives and DVD drives. You can actually see a CD drive here that's connected to a different controller, an older style controller called IDE. So we have this empty CD drive, and over here we can attach a CD if we'd like to. So we can tell it to use the optical drive on our host operating system, or more usually we're going to have an ISO file, a CD disk image that we can just attach by clicking on this icon and telling it to use that ISO file, and then probably letting it know that it's a live CD as well. In fact, if we click that icon, it will allow us to browse and find where our ISO files are. So these ISO files are what we would download from the distribution's website. So if I go to Ubuntu's website, there'll be some download links for their desktop version, and I can download that and pick that ISO, and then essentially it's like placing that disk in the CD tray. Okay, so after I did that, we can now see that it's populated down here. This ISO's in the CD drive, and it's seen as a live CD or DVD. Next is network. There's several network configurations that we can do. We won't get into all of those now. If you're interested, you can definitely go and read up about what these different kinds are in this drop down on VirtualBox's documentation. For us, NAT is just fine. It's network address translation. Okay, so skipping over ports. If we want to add anything, USB ports or anything like that, we can do some configuration in there. But looking at shared folders, here's where we can share some folders from our host operating system to our guest operating system. And this is really nice because if we're using our host operating system to store files or download files and we want to be able to quickly move them over to the guest, then we can just share a folder. And this is a very simple process. We just click this plus and then it comes up and it asks us, all right, what path do you want to share and what do you want to call it? You can check this auto mount box. Auto mount just means that it's going to automatically add this folder to your guest operating system when it boots up. And if you cared so much to have it be read-only to where that the VM could not make any writes to your host operating system folder, then you could check that box and just click OK. Okay, so obviously you can add many of these, right? Just by clicking plus here, and you can come back and you can administer them by getting rid of them or modifying the permissions on them, just using the GUI buttons. Cool, so now we have our virtual machine. It's all set up. We've allocated all of the hardware that we want. We've set up the disk image here. And at this point, we're ready to start the VM. So if we highlight it and click Start, it starts running in its own window. And this is the exact same experience we would get if we put this CD into our computer and booted it up and booted from the CD drive. So at this point, it's going to walk us through an installation. We'll get to that in another video. Did not mean to jump that far. So the next thing I wanted to show was just real quick how easy it is to import an appliance. So vendors love this feature. They can create appliances and they can put them up on their site for download, and you can just download them, import it, start it up, and it's sort of a turnkey solution there, right? It just goes ahead and works. So OVA is an appliance format. In this folder here, I have two OVAs, one for Fedora, one for Ubuntu, and let's say I want to go ahead and just import those. So these are VMs that are already installed, up and running. From VirtualBox, using the menu, so I can go to File, Import Appliance, I go ahead and find the appliance, and once I find it, it'll read that OVA file and pull out all of its configuration. This gives me a chance to go ahead and change this if I want to. We can see that this is Fedora 24. Here's the name of it. It's got 2 CPUs. It's got a gigabyte of RAM. If I'm cool with all of this, I can just click import. From there, it'll take us back to the VirtualBox Manager, and somewhere in here we would see Fedora 24_1 because that's what it was named right here. And we could just click on it and click Start, and it would just boot up, right? It would boot up in a window just like the Ubuntu one did. And then we can start using some of these other guest editions like View and going into full screen mode so we can get the full screen experience here. And these are just showing some of the other guest edition modes like shared clipboard, drag and drop, shared folders, USB. Alright, so that's our introduction to virtualization. There'll be another video going through the actual installation of these VMs. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. If not, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you.